much for coming tonight. Thank you for Phil and Hedberg Library for hosting us and for JATV for doing this. Tonight we have Michael Rehberg, and Michael grew up in Racine County attending UW-Madison and earned a master's degree in marketing. And he retired from the newspaper business after 38 years with the same company and turned his energy and attention to Black Point Estate and Gardens in Lake Geneva, the Wisconsin Historical Society's newest museum site. And as lead interpreter since 2013, he's an active docent, researcher, writer, and presenter of historical outreach programs, including ours tonight of the Beer Barons of Geneva Lake, Pull Up a Chair and Let's Take a Walk, House Research, Getting Your House to Talk, Place Names, Why Is It Called That, Land Grabs and Frontier Justice, From Temperance to Prohibition, and the Golden Era of the Steam Yachting in Geneva Lake. He has also earned a certificate from the Nonprofit Leadership Program of UW Parkside, and his interests include strategic planning, board development, and marketing for nonprofits. He's a summer resident on Lake Como since 1960, where he now lives full-time with his wife, Monica. And his hobbies include gardening and remodeling houses with his son and Monica, an interior decorator. So thank you very much, Michael, for doing this, and we look forward to your program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the reason that this program came about is, as Carol said, I started working at Black Point Estate as a house guide, a tour guide in the house. And the longer we got involved, the more we got involved, the more things we got curious about. And one of the first things I got curious about were some of the other mansions around the lake. And before long, I discovered that some of these other mansions had connections to beer. And as far as I can tell, I'm the only one who'd noticed that. And so before long, we decided that it was time to write a slideshow like this one called The Beer Barons of Geneva Lake. Then it became so popular, and I'll end up hinting at this a little later, then it became so popular that we ended up making it a boat tour. So if you want to hop on the boat with us this summer, my mic is on. Is it not loud enough?
I don't know.
Oh, all right. Well, let's find out. Is it okay? All right, we're checking. So now we hop on the boat and we drive by these, and I point out some of the same houses we're going to look at tonight. But we can also taste a beer that's connected to that house at the time. So we can't do that tonight, but June, July, and August we'll do that for the summer as well. All right. So we call it the Beer Barons of Geneva Lake, but if you're going to talk about beer barons, you're going to have to talk about Milwaukee, right? So we'll include Milwaukee for a little bit. And I'm, by the way, the title that I have is lead interpreter at Black Point Estate. What that means is I have too much curiosity. And I get curious about a story, and before long it's a PowerPoint slide show. I know there are lots of local beer brewers around, and I just love this story, so I'm going to share it. This one's from Burlington, and there were local brewers in Janesville, and there were local brewers in a brewery at the time was sort of like a bakery and a butcher shop. It was a local business. So in 1859, Jacob Muth suggested that his beer was terrific, and you'll feel as well as a muskrat, as strong as a lion, and happy as a man with the best feeling towards his fellow beings if you'll only drink Burlington Jacob Muth beer. All right. Now, not everybody liked beer, however. This is 1840. This is Wisconsin, and it's the first temperance journal saying, no, we ought not have any beer at all. And sure enough, there are 14 delegates from Racine County and 17 from Walworth County at the First Society in Milwaukee. 1840. Prohibition is 1920. So see how long we've been struggling with temperance. Lots of things coming up at the estate. We'll open for tours in May. There are boat beer tours. I just told you about those. We'll have walking tours in September and October in downtown Lake Geneva. Those are called Sordid and Scandalous. We kind of go through the steamier side of Lake Geneva history. We have a train ride at East Troy, electric train ride, and we do beer tasting there in September. And there's lots of other special events. We'd be happy to have you volunteer. We have speaking parts, we have non-speaking parts, and you can go to the website if you want to be a part of our organization. But we came to talk about beer. Today I want to introduce you to Conrad Sipe. He's the fellow who built the house that's still on Geneva Lake. I'll talk about the brewing neighbors, and we'll talk about Milwaukee and a little bit about beer and trivia and things like that, and finish up with craft brewing and consolidations. Here's an advertisement from Sipe Beer from the Chicago Tribune, turn of the century, about 1900 or so. And we know that because it's been headlined, we've been maintaining our quality for 47 years. And he's talking about 4 brands, Extra Pale, Salvatore, and some of the others there in that advertisement. So, Conrad's from Germany, grew up near Hessen, Langen, if you will, near Frankfurt, 1825. When he's 20 or so, he gets conscripted into the army. And this is just before the German social revolutions of 1848 and so forth. Finds himself defending the Duke and Duchess of Hessen. Doesn't like the fact that he's pointing his rifle at cousins and friends and says enough of this and leaves Germany. That's the house he built, and if you've been to the house, you've seen that portrait of Conrad. This is where he was born in Germany. The house is still standing. And he grew up as in the house of a farmer and a carpenter. As I said, he was conscripted at 20 years old, and he moves to America in 1849 and stops in Rochester, New York for 1 year. I find him in the city directory there as a cabinet maker. Now, you think of him as a beer brewer, but when he came to America, his first job was his dad's job, a carpenter. He marries Maria in Rochester. That's his first wife. They have 5 children together. 3 survive to adulthood, and they are the children. His first son from that marriage is the one that runs the brewery after he does. They move to Lyons, Illinois, and he gets his first beer job driving a horse-drawn beer wagon. That's his first introduction to beer. He was never a brew master the way you were talking about. He was always an entrepreneur. That's a very distinction. He was never the brewmaster. He was always the entrepreneur. He operates a small hotel in the Loop for a number of years, makes enough money that he can buy an 80-acre farm, going right back to his father's occupation. And then he comes back into town, and in 1854, he buys his first brewery. And some records say he rented it, hard to tell. But he's only been in America for 5 years, and that's the same time that he becomes a naturalized citizen. That brewery burns down a year later, so he says, enough of this, I'm going to build one out of brick, and I'll build it on the shore of Lake Michigan. Built at 27th and Cottage Grove, so 27 blocks south of the Loop, if you will. And he brews with Lake Michigan water. He's lagering cellars underground. Maria and himself, he and Maria live upstairs on the 2nd floor of the brewery. So think about that. He's brewing beer on the 1st floor, living on the 2nd floor, storing barley on the 3rd floor. We're talking about rags to riches, first-generation entrepreneur, where he's living in the factory, if you will, at first. And then 3 years later, he wants to grow, and he gets a partner, Frederick Lehman. They call themselves Sipe and Lehman, so it wasn't always called Sipe Brewery. Sometimes it was Sipe and Lehman. 50 employees, and they do about 50,000 barrels of beer. There's a picture of the brewery in Chicago. You can see the lakefront out to the right, and so we're looking over the brewery. We're in our drone from this period. You can see the railroad tracks are against the shore, and that's his brewery there. I wouldn't be surprised if it looks like every other brewery from that period. 1864, he moves out of the factory and builds a mansion for his wife, Maria. We have one picture of it, and that's a picture with the mansion in the background. So all I can tell you is a big stone mansion that he built for Maria. And that was 9 years after coming to America. Maria dies at age 38. He's got a brewery to run. He's got kids to raise, so he marries Katerina, who's 21 years old to his 41 years old. They have 6 children, and 5 will survive to adulthood. And those are the children who end up inheriting the house in Wisconsin, at Black Point, at Lake Geneva. So the 2 families get along. One is old enough that they are running the brewery after Conrad dies. The other is young enough that they can inherit the house on Geneva Lake for 4 generations. So they're very separate families. Katerina lived in Westhofen, a little farther south from Frankfurt than Conrad. They didn't know each other. 30 miles away. That'd be a 2-day trip in those days, so I'm not surprised. All the way through the Civil War and after, he brews about 50,000 barrels of beer. But what happens in 1871? Oh, Chicago fire. A third of Chicago's brewing capacity burns. 5 of 12 breweries burn down. It's the easiest way for him to become the largest brewer in America. And for 1 year he is, until the fellows from Milwaukee take over. And after that, it never happens that Chicago is the largest. But he was the largest brewer in Chicago for 30 years. His partner, Frederick Lehman, is killed in a horse and buggy accident by the address. You can tell it's near the factory, near the brewery. The horse gets spooked, the buggy tips over, he hits his head on a brick street and dies. Conrad buys out the brewery, and then he changes the name of the company, buys out the shares that the family owned, and now it's the Conrad Sight Brewing Company. In 1873, as I said, he brews more beer than any other brewer in America, and it's about 100,000 barrels is all it takes in that year. Here's a quick idea about what's going on in the brewing business in Chicago. First year he's doing 1,000 barrels, then he's doing 50,000 during the Civil War. After the Civil War he's doing about 100,000. The company is going to do as many as 275,000 barrels later, but that's not enough to be number one. It's going to take more than that. Pabst takes over in 1879 with 168 barrels. Schlitz is doing 120. So that's the end of his history. So there's another successful brewery picture. This is the same brewery. This time we've got our drone over the water and we're looking back over the city. You can see the railroad tracks at the shore there as well. 1881, he buys another brewery, so he expands by getting another brewery, buys from Frank Walther, and it's called West Side Brewery. He keeps the name West Side Brewery. And in 1887, it's time for Katerina to have her own mansion. You wouldn't want your second wife to have the first wife's mansion, right? So you just buy another one, just build another one. And we have a little better picture of that one. Designed by Adolf Kudell. Adolf Kudell is also the architect of the house in Lake Geneva. Famous in Chicago, German architect, famous in Chicago for a number of buildings, including the McCormick Mansion. This is Cyrus McCormick, not the Salt and Pepper McCormick and not newspaper McCormick, but Cyrus. That was on Rush Street. It's been torn down. But Conrad has been coming to Geneva for a number of years. He stays at this hotel. It's a Piscataqua Hotel, it was called, in Williams Bay. This is very similar to the hotel that we think of at the Grand Hotel at Mackinac. The only difference is this was built on Geneva 7 years earlier. And I'll tell you more about that a little later. But he spent a summer there, and sometimes he would stay in campgrounds. This case, a campground became for sale. It was not successful. And some of the camping in Lake Geneva at the time were these kinds of fancy tents with wooden floors and wooden walls and canvas tops. And so he bought this one. He bought Warwick Park. And I think this is a fanciful advertisement. I don't believe the trees were large enough to have birds' nests big enough for people to stand in them. Maybe. I doubt it. But this observation tower makes good sense. I'll show you another picture later. This is the highest point on the South Shore. And so I can imagine the observation tower was very popular. Oh, there's the picture right there. All right, so they call the place the Lorelei. And we were talking before we started that the Lorelei is a German legend, a German traditional story. If you've been on the Rhine River, you may know. The picture on the left is the Rhine River. And that's the magic mountain with a dangerous curve around the mountain. A beautiful maiden is at the top of the mountain, and she's combing her golden hair and singing her beautiful songs and distracting the sailors. But it's a beautiful magic mountain. So when Conrad buys Warwick Park on the south shore of Geneva Lake, it's not surprising that he calls it the Lorelei. And that was very traditional. All the mansions in Geneva all have their own names, and the new owner changes the name all the time, but you get names like Jerseyhurst because I'm from New Jersey, Flowerside for obvious reasons, things like that. So they call it the Lorelei. They move in July of '88. They build the servants' quarters first, and the carpenters live in that until they finish the house. They build in '88, but the summers of '88 and '89 are Conrad's only 2 summers in that house because he dies of pneumonia in 1890. And the news is important here only in the sense of you get a feel for the character of this guy when you look at his donations. Many of the people around Geneva Lake started the symphony and the Art Institute and those kind of cultural institutions. Conrad gave money to the old people's homes, to the orphanages, and to hospitals. He had a very different point of view in terms of maybe that's that first generation, did it myself kind of point of view. So the interesting to see how he left with a $4 million estate. In today's money, that'd be $100 million. This is the guy who came to Rochester as a cabinet maker, So it's really a very successful guy, entrepreneur. What made him successful? He was good at promotion and marketing and advertising. He was good at shipping, or his company was. They shipped a lot of beer, and this is now breaking away from this idea that a brewery is like a butcher shop and a bakery, shipping beer. His most popular brand, Salvatore, was popular with miners in California and in Colorado. He did company saloons and beer gardens, and he had tied houses. Now, that may not be a familiar idea, but let's say you would like to run a tavern. And if you want to run a tavern for me in downtown Chicago, I'll be happy to go to City Hall, and I'll get you the license. And I'll buy you the glasses. And I'll buy you the big mirror for behind the bar. And I'll set you all up. The only thing you have to do is agree to only sell my beer. So you are tied to me. Sipe did it. Pabst did it, Schlitz did it. If you go to downtown Chicago, if you go to downtown Milwaukee, downtown Kenosha, Racine, and you look at 4 corners and you see on the second floor a Schlitz logo or a Pabst logo, that was a tied house. Now, and that's one of the many things that got us prohibition. Because those tied houses, Pabst on one corner, Blatz on another corner, Schlitz on another corner, Sipe on another corner, competed with each other with salty free sandwiches to see who could sell the most beer. And we were upset by those saloons for that reason. So that was one of it. He was also lucky that the Germans were coming into Chicago to rebuild after the fire. What did Germans like to drink after work? Lager beer. Spared by the fire, purchased expansion, and he also, his son, experimented with home delivery. After 1900, you could call up the factory and they'd deliver a case of beer. This is one of the things that changed with Prohibition. Before Prohibition, a brewer could sell their beer. After Prohibition, we required wholesalers in the middle. We separated brewers from the retail separation. And that's been a struggle for craft brewers now because they are the brewers and they'd like to sell their own beer, but our laws said, no, you got to have a wholesaler in the middle. It's been a struggle. Part of his promotional, he was good at the World's Fair in 1893. You can see at the streets of Constantinople there, you could get a Pilsner for 5 cents a glass. And even in downtown Lake Geneva. Anybody been in Lake Geneva? Ever buy any ice cream at this place? Kilwins? All right, so now you know where you are. And so here's the biggest hotel that was built in 1838, stayed for till 1920 or so, the Lake House. And look at all the beer signs on the side of it, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. But if you look closely and we zoom in, we find that Conrad Sipes' logo, his Pilsner, is there. So Conrad's even advertising in Lake Geneva. As long as Blatz was also doing there. So here's one of his Conrad's early advertisements. This one, we don't have a date on it, but I can tell you when it happened because the headline says it meets every requirement of the pure food law. The first United States pure food law happened in about 1906, right after Upton Sinclair published the book, The Jungle, talking about the meatpacking industry. And then we had a law that says you have to have pure food. And so Conrad is good enough to say, my beer is pure food. And that's the case that you would have had the factory would have delivered if you called up the factory. He had a lot of brands. If you go online, you can find all sorts of brands, labels that are available. It took me a long time to figure this one out. Extra Pale Siegel Cooper. Anybody recognize Siegel Cooper? It was a surprise to me when I finally discovered one day that it was a department store in Chicago. So what he was doing was private labeling his beer for the equivalent of Marshall Field, a competitor of Marshall Field. Siegel Cooper. More brands. And here's a couple of interesting ones we'll come back to a little later. Salvo. 1890, we had an economic change in the world, and there's a depression going on in England. English investors come to America looking for places to invest. And they find the beer industry all across the country ripe for reinvention. The beer companies want to switch from keg beer to bottled beer so that more of the beer can be served at home because those saloons are so terrible. Remember, prohibition's coming. And they also want to get away from natural ice and start using mechanical ice. So they need mechanical refrigeration. Both require a lot of expenses. So what happens in Baltimore is 16 brewers turn into one company. In Pittsburgh, there are groups of 21 and 15. In Boston, there are 10 breweries that turn into one company. And Conrad's brewery combines with two other breweries and 2 malting companies and becomes the City of Chicago Consolidated Malting and Brewing Company. 1890. Has nothing to do with the fact that it's also the year that he died. It's an economic phenomena going on all across the country. Finally, though, brewing offered the family in Geneva 2 mansions in Chicago, one for each wife, a summer cottage on Geneva Lake. Katerina, by the way, after living there for a while, she lived until 1920. He died in 1890, so she was a widow for 30 years on the lake. So she expanded the original 15 acres to 100, became a fully functional farm supporting the whole family. Chickens and cows and horses. They had 40 acres of farmland. Of course, it was a massive brewing facility and beneficiaries in Chicago, which I told you about, and lots of beneficiaries in Geneva, too. And a social status that's kind of interesting. There's another postcard picture of the house. But if you think about what a brewer's social status was like, there's a story from the 1929 Chicago Tribune that says in the 1850s, a brewer like Michael DeVersey had the same status as bankers, railroad presidents, and so forth. And when I go through the Chicago Blue Books, which were the list of all the fancy people, all the rich people, I find mixed in with all the people we know, the Fields and the Armours, the Palmers and the McCormicks, the brewers, the Hucks and the Whackers, the Sipes and the Brands. Those are all mixed in. They're all just the same kind of thing. Katerina's day for having visitors was Tuesday afternoon. That was that tradition of you visit leave your card on the counter and she'll tell you whether she's home. Tuesday afternoon for Katerina. All right, well, we came to talk about the brewers on Geneva Lake, and here I am spending all my time talking about Conrad. The first one is the Lorelei, and of course it became known as Black Point in the early 1900s, about 1910. anti-German sentiment got a little strong around World War I. And so it was impolite to call my mansion by such a German legend. So they went back to the Potawatomi name for the site, which was Black Point, because it had a canopy of black oak trees. So that's how it became Black Point. It was originally Black Point. All right, so here's where the first of the brewing houses on Geneva Lakes is. This is a little kind of a silly map to get used to at first, because north is to the right. Okay, so you got to remember that Lake Geneva is, the city of Lake Geneva is at the bottom, at the east, and the village of Fontana is at the top, which is west. So Conrad's house is at Black Point on the west, on the south shore. See, now I'm confused. So other estates, here are the estates that are connected with beer. Here's the ones we're talking about. The Wadsworth Hall, Era Glen, Villa Palatina, Forest Glen, Fair Lawn, Leffens, and one other, which I'll leave for last. They're kind of a surprise. So there's number one. Let's talk about number two, Wadsworth Hall. Wadsworth Hall is one of those mansions that's had lots of names over the time frame, but it looks like this. Pretty famous. Originally built by the Harris Bank family, Norman Harris, and then it was owned by the Morton Salt people out of Chicago, and then they had in-laws that were the Yellow Cab Company, and then Richard Driehaus bought it, and he was a preservationist and a capital financier from Chicago. He remodeled it about to turn around the year 2000, and then it sold to Chris and Ann Ray's maybe 3 years ago, not more than 3 or 4, for $36 million. This is 14,000 square feet. This is 10 bedrooms. It has a guest house with 4 bedrooms and 40 acres, but $36 million. So we were talking about what the things cost per front foot. Well, this was expensive. It certainly made the record in Wisconsin's real estate, residential real estate sales. To put it in perspective, so $36 million is the most anybody's ever paid for a house in Wisconsin, a residence. Oh, and by the way, Chris and Ann also own 2 other houses, one in Forest Lake in Illinois and another in Florida, a mansion in Florida. So they don't get to use it all the time. Minnesota's record for residential real estate is 80 million, and Iowa's record is 6 million. So we're kind of fit right in the middle, right? Chris and his brother are in the distribution business in Chicago, and guess what they distribute? Beer. So of course this is a beer-connected house these days. I never used to be able to put this on the program until 3 years ago when Chris and Ann bought it. They also distribute to McDonald's, and they also own a Coca-Cola bottling plant. Chris and his brother, I think it's Jonah, are each on the Fortune 400 list. They're each worth about $9 billion. With a B. Yep. Remember that hotel that Conrad stayed in that was like the Grand Hotel in Mackinac? Well, it was originally the Piscataqua Hotel, and it was a temperance hotel. It was built with no bar. It was supposed to be the latest thing that was good for all of us, is to go to a hotel with no bar. It was unsuccessful. In the first 5 years, it had 4 owners, and then the last owner put in a bar and brought the wrong crowd, and then John Cook, who was an Irishman who was brewing ale, bought it, and he ended up being very successful with it. Sadly, it burned down, so he rebuilt it, and the next year it burned down again, and he said, I'm smarter than that, and so he took the billiard hall, which was a house all by itself, and turned that into his residence, and he became a gentleman farmer. So here's another one connected to beer. And it's on the North Shore, the Piscataqua Hotel, number 3. And there's the billiard hall today, still on the water, still owned by someone. And so if you were with us on the boat in the summer, we'd stop here and we'd have a John Cook ale while we were looking at that house. Brewer number 4 is Fairlawn. You may recognize the name Whacker. Charles was a brewer. His dad was a maltster. We'll talk more about what a maltster is a little later. So this is a second generation brewer. And we probably think of him mostly because we have River Drive named after him in downtown Chicago. They don't call it River Drive, call it Whacker. But he's much more famous, much more critical. The reason that we really should celebrate Charles is because he had the responsibility for 16 years. He was president of the Chicago Planning and Park Commission, and he had the job of making real or executing Burnham's plan for Chicago. Daniel Burnham was the architect of the generation of the Columbian Exposition, but he was also the architect of the plan for downtown Chicago, keeping the shoreline green, not having it be all industrial. So we have Soldier Field and Shed Aquarium and all that green space because Whacker created Burnham's plan. So thank Whacker for all that. So this house, Fairlawn, stayed in the family until 1975. It's not in the family anymore. It has a spiral staircase going up the middle of it with a Tiffany dome at the top. And Charles claims that he looked at every piece of lumber before they built the house to make sure there wasn't any board with a knot in it. So it should be perfectly built. The house is still standing. And after that consolidation of 1890 I was telling you about, the company became Whacker and Burke. It was originally Burke Brothers and the Whacker Brewing Company, and they became Whacker and Burke. And there's an advertisement from Chicago for that company. So that's Fairlawn, and that's brewer number 5 around the lake, also on the south shore down here. Brewer number 6 is a really interesting one. It was sold to Ed Eline. Some of you may not recognize the Eline name. Anybody who does? Because you know their uncle, right? Uncle was Joseph Schlitz. Oh, so there's the story. So yeah, so we go by that house and we all drink a Schlitz. It's hard to find. Last year we had to go to McHenry, Illinois to get Schlitz to serve to everybody on the boat. Originally, that's the other thing I should tell you, I guess, is that originally it was called Villa Palatina, and George Weiss, who was also a beer brewer in Chicago, owned it. And then George had some trouble, self-induced. He decided he wanted to put a corner on the barley market, so he built the largest grain elevator in downtown Chicago, took a loan out of his father-in-law's bank to build the largest elevator. Then the grain prices dropped, and he went bankrupt, and he ruined his father-in-law's bank at the same time, went out of business. And so he had to sell his mansion on Geneva, so he sold it to Edward Eline, and this is what that mansion looked like. It stood on the property till about 1920 when it burned, and so it's not there anymore. This is how George Weiss lived in Chicago. That house is still in downtown Chicago. Last time it sold in 2017, it was about $4 million house. There's a master bedroom for you with, of course, if you were in downtown Chicago, you'd want to have a greenhouse on the roof, right? That's how they lived, but you get a feel for it. This is a little bit more of the landscaping that was done. Ed Eline described himself as a horticulturalist first and a beer brewer second. He hired Jens Jensen, a famous landscape architect from Denmark, to landscape his 70 acres. Both sides of the road, he had trout streams and stony brooks, and he had bridges and all those little walkways or parks and stuff. And on Sunday, he'd open it up to the public. It was like a public park on Sunday. So he was very generous in that regard. Edward was the one of the brothers. Well, I don't think I know. See if I have. No, I don't have that. Whoops. I'll tell you a little bit about. No, I do have that. It's a little later when we talk about Schlitz. Never mind. Brewer number 7 is Thies Leffens. Leffens may not be familiar to you. Wasn't familiar to me either. He had the good fortune to marry one of Conrad's daughters and became the treasurer and secretary of the brewery for the rest of his life. He also had an insurance and a banking business in Chicago. He was active in the brewery. I don't mean to be disparaging. He was active in the brewing business. He was president of the National Brewers League for a couple of years, so he was active as well. That house is not there anymore. It was also torn down. The best story, of course, is about his dog. They had a black Cocker Spaniel, Nero, and they had trained the dog on Sunday to run down to the pier, grab the paper, and bring it up to the house. And in return, Nero got his own seat on the train going back to Chicago. So that was a good deal for both of them. Leffens lived, he had about 80 or 100 acres, and he lived very close to Black Point on the South Shore as well. So that's number 7, I think. Yep, and then here's number 8. We're going to hold that one for last. Also on the South Shore, but I'll summarize with him later. Let's take a little look at Milwaukee. And of course, we'd have to ride a vehicle like this with sausage for wheels and beer bottles for headlights to take a tour of Milwaukee. Maybe you'd rather travel in this vehicle. Powered by Joy Water, yeah. It's a little hard to read, but down here it says powered by Joy Water. We have Schweitzer Kasse, Pumpernickel, Frankfurter, and sauerkraut in those tubs as well. All right, so there's 4 big brewers in Milwaukee. I think we all know the names. They're not so critical, but here's what I think is most interesting. 3 of them became brewers through marriage. 3 of them became brewers through marriage. Only Miller came to America knowing how to brew beer. Now, it's maybe fair to say that Blatz knew something about it as well, but the others, Schlitz was an accountant. So Blatz's brewery looks just like Conrad's brewery, doesn't it, in downtown Milwaukee? Blatz was the only Milwaukee company that consolidated during that consolidation I was talking about, and he became the president of a number of breweries that included Chicago breweries as well. But Blatz was, of the Milwaukee brewers, he was the only one to involve himself in consolidation. And descendants marry into the Blatz family, or Sipe family. All right, so we start with Bill Madlinger. Bill Madlinger passed away last summer. He lived in a house with that his family had right next to Black Point Estate, pretty much next door neighbors. And his mother was Elsa, one of Conrad's daughters. Elsa marries Albert. Albert's mother's maiden name, Blatz. So Bill marries a Sipe, beer brewer, marries a Blatz. So they married right into the Blatz family as well. So the Sipes and the Blatz are all hooked together. All right? Schlitz. He comes to Milwaukee in 1850, marries the Bross's widow, takes advantage of the Chicago fire, overtakes Pabst, all the rest of that stuff. Lose money selling E-line chocolate during Prohibition. So that was one of the things that they did to keep busy during Prohibition was they sold chocolate, sold candy. The brewers did a lot of crazy things during Prohibition to stay alive. Gettleman made snowplows. You figure it out. All right, so ended up they made some mistakes by 1976, making a bad beer, trying to use chemistry instead of brewing technique, and they became failure. Schlitz was lost at sea coming back from Germany in a boating accident, and in his will, he said that the nephew should take over. So Edward is the one who went to Lake Geneva. Edward is the one who was the horticulturist who built the horticulture. So Edward is the one who built 75 tied houses in Chicago. And to give you a feel for how much beer Schlitz was distributing in Chicago, there were 70 teams of horses delivering barrels of beer to Saloon every day for just Schlitz. And then there was Pabst, and then there was Blatz, and then there was Miller, and then there was Sipe. And you just it's amazing to think about the quantity of beer that was being produced. Ed Eline had a couple of daughters who married, 4 years apart, a couple of Sipe boys. So yes, the Sipe family married into the Schlitz family also. This is the same Schlitz, by the way, that sold vitamin D beer. You know, it was the University of Wisconsin that isolated vitamin D and figured out all the things about it, and then it became popular. So for 2 or 3 years, like 36 to 38 or somewhere in that range, you could get vitamin D beer. It was, so beer is nowhere near as healthy now as it was then, right? All right. Anybody recognize this guy? It's really a puzzler. They call him Captain Pabst because his first job was running this steamship on Lake Michigan. Captain Pabst. And then he got spooked one day during a bad storm, and he had to beach his Comet near Manitowoc because the storm was so dangerous. He just had to bring it to shore. And he said, I don't want to do this anymore. I think what I'll do is marry that daughter of the guy who was riding with me who went to Sheboygan to buy barley. Well, it turns out that was Pabst. That was Philip Best. And Maria was his daughter. Now, there's another story, I don't know that I buy this one as much, but that says that he rescued Maria. She somehow fell off the boat, and he rescued her, and that's how they met. I like the story that she just rode along with Dad to go to Sheboygan to buy barley better, so I'm going with that story. In any case, Philip was the original brewer, and his father, Jacob, was a brewer as well. So we're already in the second generation of Milwaukee brewers when Pabst marries the third generation daughter. Philip has brothers who are also in the brewing business. Pabst, by the way, uses blue ribbons to distinguish his beer from everyone else's in as early as 1882. And in every one of my presentations, I always tell everybody he did not win a blue ribbon at the World's Fair. Nobody won a blue ribbon at the World's Fair. They gave out gold medals. He did win a gold medal, but nobody won blue ribbons. But it was his way of distinguishing his brown bottle of beer from everyone else's brown bottle of beer, and he'd been doing it since 1882. And so before long, people would show up at the saloon and say, give me one of those blue ribbon beers. And it didn't take long for Pabst to say, what a good idea, we'll call it that. So that's how the name came. They kept using blue ribbons until World War I, when silk shortages made it difficult, and it was labor intensive to do as well. The silk was being used for parachutes in World War I. During Prohibition, Pabst made cheese. You may know in Oconomowoc there was Pabst Farms. He was doing dairy cows there, and he was also breeding horses. He was breeding Percherons, another very heavy Belgian breed of horse, like the Clydesdales that St. Louis uses.
Not a breed of a Belgian. They're two entirely different. I bred Percherons.
Oh, tell me more.
Percherons are from La Perche, France.
From France, not Belgium.
Exactly.
Ah, okay, thank you.
And they're the most animated of the draft horse breeds, and they are the only draft horse breed that has Arabian blood in it.
And Arabian blood in the Percherons. Wow, cool. So he had it right. Pabst had it right, and Anheuser-Busch probably were using second-rate horses, right?
Clydesdales have white feet.
Yeah, white feet.
Soft.
Soft.
And they have issues, where Percherons have usually the dark feet, unless you happen to have a gray perch.
Yeah, all right.
But they're known for soft hooves.
Soft hooves. Well, good for you. Thank you for that. So anyway, the story goes that either at the end of Prohibition, Pabst either sold his cheese to Velveeta or was sued away from him. We're not sure whether he got really sued or what, but essentially it's Velveeta is what he was doing. So they had a dairy farm in Oconomowoc, and they were raising horses from France. Pabst marries into the Best family, and you've seen logos that the Pabst Brewing logos sometimes has a big B in it, and that's because it was originally the Best family. And he changes the name of the company from Best Brewing to Pabst Brewing, and he uses this clever phrase: he who drinks best drinks Pabst. So I told you Conrad was pretty good at promotion too. What do you suppose Conrad does? He puts out a mug that says, well, this is just a little better than the kind you thought was best. Now, they were poking fun at each other. You know, they were friends. Pabst was indeed an honorary pallbearer at Sipes' funeral. We have pictures of the Pabst family in the albums of the Sipe family. But business is business, and my beer is better than your business. So Miller, it comes from Germany. He's trained as a brewery, and he knows how to brew beer. The story says that he spent a year in New York with at least $100 in gold in his pocket before he comes to Milwaukee, gets to the Menominee Valley and buys some of the best family brewing that they're not interested in having anymore, including this now was originally built by the Best family, but now it becomes Miller's Plank Road Brewing. And up there at the top, way up here in the corner, is Milwaukee's first beer garden. I think the most important story to tell about the Miller story is the Miller Lite story. Depending on, again, which source you want, light beer either started with Coors in Colorado or with Gablingers in New York. And Gablingers is the more typical story, where they were brewing a diet beer for men. And with a phrase like that, it was very unpopular. And they were very unsuccessful. And finally, either they gave or they sold the recipe to Meisterbrau in Chicago, which also started selling diet beer for men, or diet beer. And they were just not doing well at all with the word diet in it. Meisterbrau, about to go out of business, ends up giving or selling the recipe to Miller in Chicago just at the time that Miller changes ownership from the Grace Company to Philip Morris. Philip Morris knows how to advertise things. Philip knows how to promote things. And so it becomes light beer for Miller, not diet beer for men. And that's how it became successful. So there's your tour of Milwaukee. We'll just leave in this little car, beer barrel car as well. And we'll do a quick Chicago tour to give you a hint about who Conrad was competing with. Here's another one of those. You can't get around it. It's the Pure Food Beer. So it's from that same 1906 era. And the first beer made in Chicago is 1833. This is really early. And the company is always one company, but it always changes names every couple of years. Haas and Sulzer becomes Haas and Ogden. Ogden becomes Lill and Ogden. Then it becomes Lill and Diversey, and they stay in business for a much longer time. But even by 1846, Chicago is making 16,000 barrels of beer, and Milwaukee's importing 25,000 barrels of beer, exporting or importing to Chicago. So early on, Milwaukee takes over. So here's what the big brewers in Chicago, 1875, if you will, 10 years after the Civil War. Conrad's doing 100,000 barrels, as I said. It takes two of his larger competitors to match his volume, and then there's a few others as well. Here's another. There are more brewers in Chicago, but just all we want to remember tonight is that he was bigger than the next two combined. So there's our tour of Chicago. All right, let's do some trivia. What's beer like in 1900? Well, of course, it's a tonic which all physicians favor. Prescribe it to the weak, the rundown, the convalescent. They recommend it to well people who want to stay well. That's what Schlitz thought in 1900. It's a universal cure, is according to Pabst and Schlitz. Chronic and advanced digestive disorders, a permanent cure will be affected by the highly use of a liquid malt beverage. What about for 1500 or so? The Reinheitsgebot is a German pure food rule that says beer can only be made by three things, three ingredients, and they are water, barley, and hops. They're missing one ingredient, and that's because they thought it was magic. That's yeast. They knew it existed. They knew about mothers, and they knew they had to have for the old batch, for the new batch, but yeast they had to wait for Pasteur to help them with that. So to deal with beer in general, we have to start with the idea that there are only two kinds of beer. and everything else is a subcategory. So the first kind is lager. So to talk about lager, I have to talk about the other one. And the other one is ale. Ale's been around the longest. Ale was probably not invented, it was probably discovered. Mesopotamia, Egypt, someplace, somebody had a pail out and there was some grain in it, and it rained, and wild yeast came along, and it got foamy, and I drank some of it, and I felt pretty good, and I didn't get sick like I do when I drink the river. I'll make some more. Put some goop from the first bucket into another bucket, add some water, add some grain, add some water, and wait for a while. I got more ale. Ale tends to be not very carbonated, brews quickly because it's at room temperature, goes sour quickly because it's at room temperature, pretty alcoholic, kind of strong, and always kind of dark and cloudy originally. Now, these days we can make it differently. Originally, because the yeast is sitting at the top of the barrel and it's dripping stuff through all the time. So it's always cloudy. It's always got little pieces of yeast and other material in it. That's ale. Been around for a very long time. Lager is a recent one, and it was an invention. These are monks in Germany, 1500, 1600, experimenting with a yeast that will only grow, eat sugar, make alcohol, will only grow if the temperature is under 40 degrees. So now it grows slowly because it's colder, and the reason we call it lager is because the German word for storage and resting is lagern. So, lagerned beer is beer that has been stored or rested long enough to mature and become rich beer. It is, however, more carbonated. It is clearer because the yeast is at the bottom of the barrel. The only thing coming up through it are those little bubbles you see in a Miller High Life ad. And it's not as alcoholic. And that's why Germans can spend all afternoon at the beer garden drinking lager. But if they were drinking ale, they'd be tipped over by 3:30 in the afternoon, right? So lager tends to be more refreshing and less alcoholic. Those are broad rules. So it's a very different beverage. Couldn't come to America until we invent clipper ships. Lager requires yeast that stays cold, and you can't bring it across an 8-week ocean voyage because it'll get too warm. You can't bring enough ice. So until we can invent clipper ships and get across the ocean in 3 or 4 weeks, can we bring lager beer. So lager beer comes to America in the 1840s, something like maybe a little earlier in Philadelphia, but 1845 in Chicago. Oh, and there are subcategories of all these beers as well. Ales and porters and stouts and wheat beers are all in that ale category. Lagers and bocks and malt liquors are all in the lager category. And even inside the bock category, there's Doppelbock and Maibock and Export Bock and IPA. And, we don't have time to talk about all those, but there is that other program I'll be happy to offer, How to Drink a Beer, that we'll spend an hour on that. Even more types. Yes, sake is a beer. Sake is a beer because it's made with a grain. And for some reason we call it wine, but it's made with a grain. The grain is rice, fermented rice, and so it is literally, technically a beer. But technically a tomato is a fruit, so, who knows? When do lagers appear? Well, I told you that, 1847, 1850. Now, a little bit about the history in Chicago. Railroads come in 57. We have shortage of beer. Philip Best and Blatz and Schlitz are doing the same. By the 1860s, there's 32 brewers in Chicago. Let's talk a little bit about how to brew beer. First, we take barley and turn it into malt. Now, barley, I forgot to tell you when the Reinheitsgebot said that why would we make all our beer out of barley? Well, we were saving the wheat for bread. We were saving the wheat for people, and we could just make beer out of the horse food. Well, it turns out barley is perfect for beer because it has the right amount of starch that converts to sugars when it is malted. When it's malted, it's soaked in water until it sprouts. Remember, it's a seed. As soon as it sprouts, we stop it from growing by toasting it, by roasting it. If you roast it a little bit at a low temperature, you get a caramel kind of flavor. If you toast it and roast it at a high temperature for a long time, you get almost a chocolate or a darker roasted flavor, very different, a Maillard reaction compared to a caramelized reaction. So the color of a beer is all dependent on how you malt it, how you dry the malt, after the barley after it sprouts. So the first thing you do is sprout the seed and then dry it. Second thing you do is you boil it in water. Well, you grind it up a little bit, make it like cornmeal first, and then boil it in water for a while. Now you've got a sugary kind of molasses kind of flavored, really sweet brew. And then you have to sort out, get rid of all the barley, all the pieces, and you sort it and you turn it into wort. Wort is a German word that means root, the root of the beer. Not root beer, root of the beer. And now you have a clear liquid that is ready for turning into beer after you cool it off, after it's boiled, cool it off, and you can pitch the yeast, they say. You can add the yeast to it. Can't be too hot or the yeast will die. And then if it's ale, you wait 5 days and it's ready. If it's lager, you wait 5 weeks, 10 weeks, and then it's ready. So now you know how to make beer. One slide. Add hops. Hops are an interesting connection to the whole thing. Hops were not always part of beer. They came around in about the 15 or 1600s. Beer is a lot older than that. Originally from Czechoslovakia. 500 years later, even the English discovered they could grow hops, and that would be a good thing to add to beer. Then hops were grown in New York State in the United States, and they were grown in Wisconsin during the Civil War, mostly for 5 or 6 years, and lots of hops growers in Sauk City and Baraboo and that area were doing 60 or 70% of all the hops in America. Then there was a boom and a bust, and they moved out to the west. And now all the hops are grown in Oregon and the Cascade area, Oregon and Washington State. It's a female plant of a perennial vine. You pick all these little blossoms off, and it has esters and oils in them that are both a bittering agent and a preservative, the two magics. And about 1900, there were a couple dozen different varieties. Now there are a couple hundred different varieties with all sorts of different flavors, all changing the kind of beer you like. I just get a kick out of this. I live on a small lake near Lake Geneva. It's called Lake Como, and there's the edge of it. And about a mile down the creek is a hop yard from 1873. So it was a local brewery needing a 4-acre hop yard. Here's how hops are harvested. It was a family effort, like a barn, a quilting bee or a barn raising. People would come out. Here's an illustration from Germany of picking the hops. And the hops have to then be dried right quickly, because otherwise they'll turn sour, like a pile of cut grass will turn sour. So they have to be dried quickly. 1867, this is kind of a clue about whether making beer those days was a hard job. The Sterneworth was a rule that says beer brewers could have a daily ration of beer, and it would be available in quarts, and you could get one at 6, 9, 11, 2, and 4 p.m., but you could only have 3 quarts at each break. So the answer to was it hard work? Yes. Yeah. I did leave this in. The only point I'll make is, well, this hard work, is that there was almost a strike of brewery workers during that time. Conrad's brewery did not strike, but they were able to successfully get down to a 10-hour day and only 4 hours on Sunday. That's how hard the work was. All right, let's talk about promotion. World Conrad's promotion, 1893. We found on eBay a copy of this booklet, which was a souvenir that he handed out in 1893, the World's Fair. And he said in the front page of it, in the most advanced civilizations where citizens are inventors, lawyers, doctors, merchants, and so forth, that's where you're going to find the products of the brewery at their finest. And that's going to be England, Germany, and the United States. So here's his fermenting room. This is Conrad showing pictures of all the beer that's fermenting in his brewery at the lake shore. We saw those pictures earlier. It's really hard to get the scope of how much beer was being produced. These are the ice machines, and they are produced, the ice is being produced by the steam engines. Yes, we're making steam to make ice originally. Of course, you can't deliver barrels of beer without horses, so Conrad has stables as well. It's a little hard to read, but that's a picture of the horses delivering barrels of beer to Chicago. And then he advertises some of the beers that are available. So here's Salvatore, which is an export beer, shipping beer. Pleasant to the taste, very invigorating. Physicians prescribe it in their daily practice. It's for convalescents and persons who are physically weak. 1893 World's Fair souvenir. To the worker with a brain or the worker with muscle, it's equally valuable. Pilsner is a light-bodied and aftertaste of the hop, invigorating tonics for invalids. And the medicinal qualities are better adapted to the delicate system of the invalid, who only needs a gentle stimulant. So if you need just a gentle stimulant, I'd go for a Pilsner. And then the last page of the booklet has all these beer bottles flying all over the place, and you recognize now this brewery. This time we have the train tracks at the shore and also a boat. And you know what the boat is called in another illustration? It's named the Lorelei. Schlitz had these little booklets as well. There's just a couple of pictures here. One is the Schlitz hop bales being dried, stored, ready for brewing beer in Schlitz. And there's their horses getting loaded up to deliver barrels. Pabst had the same kind of booklets, and there's their horses. The only difference with Pabst is they were delivering the barrels to railroads. So it's a shipping operation. Brewing is changing by the 1877. We have Louis Pasteur getting involved long before he pasteurized milk. He worked on beer. And his famous book is called Studies on Beer. And then brewing as an art is becoming brewing as science. If you look through the old literature, you'll find the beginning of people selling thermometers as a way to make sure the temperature is right, those kinds of things, as science takes over the art of brewing beer. It was peculiar of a drink in the sense that lager was shunned by the natives, non-Germans. Ale was familiar to the Americans because it had been around a lot longer. Whiskey was the drink of choice, maybe because distillation made it easier to ship corn and grain as liquid whiskey than it was as corn. And it became a bartering tool. So a little bit about temperance. You know the logic. Smoking will give you drinking. Drinking gives you intoxication. Then there'll be a bile. Bile will get jaundice. Jaundice leads to dropsy, and that's going to terminate in death. You choose. Cider drinkers, an old orchard and a distillery, no doubt, is going to show you widows, orphans, poverty, and drunkenness. That's what you get from an orchard. All right, so in 1855, there's a big lager beer riot in Chicago. The mayor, a one-term mayor, says instead of being $50 for a beer license, it should be $300, and all the saloons should close on Sunday. Unless, by the way, you happen to be born not in a foreign country, but in America, then you could stay open. But 80% of the saloons in Chicago were German. So there was a big trial. There were shots fired. People died. The mayor loses his coalition, does not become second-term mayor, and the Blue Law failed for another 10 years based on the riot of 1855. Mark Twain says it best, of course, nothing needs so reforming as other people's habits. It's the prohibition that makes anything precious. Capone said it pretty well, too. All I ever did was supply a demand that was pretty popular. So, what did Conrad say? He goes to the 1874 National Beer Brewing Conference, and the newspaper always writes up stories about what they're talking about. And here's what the brewers were thinking, 1874. Remember, 1920 is prohibition. 1874. Here's the headline in the paper. Light wines and beer, the best cure for drunkenness. And that's indeed what they were thinking about prohibition. Prohibition was for whiskey, for distilled spirits. Wine and beer was not supposed to be a part of it. Only at the last minute did that get added back. It's really a crazy story. So you have to make a near beer brewing prohibition with less than 1/2 of 1% alcohol. Pabst calls theirs Pablo, Schlitz is Famo, Vivo, Luxo, and Sipe calls his Salvo. I showed you those there before, those labels. So that's his non-alcoholic beer. The O at the end of all those names, I'm sure, means no alcohol. And now we finish this up with brewer number 8. We'll come back to Lake Geneva. Now that you know everything there is to know about beer, and everything to know about Milwaukee brewers. So our last brewer is Ceylon Court, and it's also on the south shore over here of the same lake. Ceylon Court connects back to the Columbian Exposition. Ceylon, an island near India. We used to call it Sri Lanka, or we call it Sri Lanka now. And that island was growing British tea. So the British take a Buddhist temple from Ceylon, bring it to the World's Fair. It's made out of mahogany and teak, and it's put together with wooden pegs, so it comes apart easily and goes together, ships easily. It's there as a celebration of British tea at the World's Fair. When it's over, it gets sold to a family who wants to bring it to Lake Geneva and turn it into a mansion. So it goes on 27 rail cars and gets brought to Lake Geneva, and it gets put on a mansion. It's still a Buddhist temple. All the bedrooms have the beds hanging from chains so the snakes can't get up the bedposts. And it stays there until the Maytags buy it. And the Maytags are the third owners of that estate. This is the same Maytag we've always known, the washing machine Maytags. This is the guy who's connected to beer, Fritz. Fritz, it turns out, in San Francisco, finishes his advanced studies in Japanese studies, his master's degree in Japanese studies, and goes to the spaghetti factory for a meal with one of his friends, and he orders an Anchor Steam beer to go with his spaghetti, and his friend says, "You know, they're going out of business." "What? That's my favorite beer." He goes down the street the next day and he buys the company. So Fritz Maytag is the one who buys Anchor Steam Brewing after these 4 generations, and Fritz is the youngest one. They were born in 1937, still alive, and lashes the wheel, goes to San Francisco and says, "We're going back to the old way. We're going to turn this into beer that tastes like beer, that tastes like good beer, the way beer is supposed to be made," and so forth. And so he's very successful. Every book you read about craft brewing lists him as one of the founders of the craft brewing industry. Starts in the mid-60s, starts at Anchor Steam. There's only about 50 breweries at the time. Jimmy Carter made some help. In 1979, he allowed for home brewing of beer. Yes, after Prohibition, it was legal to make your own wine at home, but not legal until 1979 to brew your own beer. How about that? Thanks to Billy Beer, right? Who knows? Now it's 15% of the market. There's at least 10,000 breweries. Experts are emerging. They're called cicerones, the way that sommeliers are wine experts. Cicerones are beer experts. The industry is still dominated by what was the big 2, Anheuser-Busch and SAB Miller, but those got consolidated almost 10 years ago now, 2016. Here's the 2 companies. Anheuser-Busch InBev, they're in Belgium, and they bottle Pepsi-Cola, and they have all these brands. And then SAB Miller is headquartered in London, and they bottle Coca-Cola, and they have all these brands. Well, those 2 are going to go together and become one company. But before they can do that, they got a problem in Milwaukee, right? Because they have to divest. So Molson Coors, which was owned 42 by Miller Coors, and SAB Miller owned 58 by Miller Coors, has to separate. Molson Coors is in Denver, and they have Blue Moon and all those brands. And then Miller Coors is in Chicago, and they have all those brands. And they have to separate so the other 2 big companies can come together. Wikipedia explains it. In the United States, Coors is majority owned by Miller Coors, a subsidiary of Miller, and minority owned by Molson Coors. Internationally, it's entirely owned by Molson Coors, and Miller is owned by SAB Miller. I thought that might still be confusing, so I offer you this chart. Which tells you which brands are owned by which company. And it doesn't matter if you zoom in, you still can't figure out who belongs to what, because all those brands are all part of one company, but all part of a number of them. All right, well, here's what we can finish up with. Here's our beer barons from 1885, 5 Chicago beer barons. Notice the hats. Conrad Sipe is the old-fashioned guy with the stovepipe hat, and all his buddies are wearing bowlers. Bartholomew is also from Chicago, Philip Bartholomew. Magnus is from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This is one of the Ernst brothers. There were three. We don't know which one it is, from Chicago. Thur takes over for Schoenhofen. He's the son-in-law, and so he becomes the next brewer. And Brand was Michael Brand of Bush and Brand Brewing in Chicago as well. So it's all his buddies. They're all together. And that's all we know about this photo. But you get a feel for how different it was in 1885. These 5-6 guys all competing with each other in Chicago. Today, there are 5 big brewers. Anheuser-Busch InBev, one company in Belgium. Heineken is in Holland. China Resources, you can probably figure out where they're from. Carlsberg is from Denmark, and Molson Coors in Chicago are the big 5. So, with that said, thanks for your attention, and I wonder if there are some questions.
Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. I went a little long. Oh, and by the way, there's a handout if you want to learn more. The handout has websites and stuff. I'll leave those here. Any thoughts or questions?
Questions, anyone?
Do you know the story behind Leinenkugel?
Do I know the story behind Leinenkugels? Well, the most recent story is a sad one, and it's not the first sad one, and that is that Leinenkugels sold themselves to Miller, right, a number of years ago, kept Leinenkugels going up north. What's the city? Chippewa Falls. Only to have Miller say, well, you know, it's really not efficient. We should be doing all this Leinenkugel. It's not in Chippewa Falls, but we should be doing it in Milwaukee or some other city. So we're going to shut you down. Now the Leinenkugel brothers said, wait a minute, that's not fair. All these people have been working there. We like it. We think we should do it. Well, how about if we just buy the name or buy something and let us run something up there in Chippewa Falls? And Miller says, no. So that's the story I know. I don't know if that's close. The same is true with Anchor Steam. Anchor Steam was owned by Maytag for a number of years, became successful. When we were on the boat and we'd go point at where Ceylon Estate used to be, we used to drink Anchor Steam. Then he became unsuccessful, got bought out by Sapporo, a Japanese brewer, for a number of years. Then they were unsuccessful, and most recently it got purchased by a yogurt company. And so I think they're still making beer in San Francisco, but we can't get it here anymore. Even though the employees there also tried to buy out what was left of the company. So there's a lot of that consolidation going on. It's a good thought. Someone else? Well, all right. Thanks for putting up with more than an hour.
Thank you very much.